Our next presenter is Alejandro Baer. Alejandro is associate professor at the Department of Sociology, where he is the Stephen Feinstein Chair and Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. His research interest focuses on collective memory and transitional justice studies, also in the social-political consequence of memory narratives and the delicate relationship between process of collective remembering, reconciliatory initiatives, and the demands of justice in post-conflict or post-authoritarian societies. His recent publications explore processes of memory, forgetting, and representation of the Holocaust, and the relationship of visual image and memory in the Holocaust audiovisual testimonies. The presentation today is called The Trauma Metaphor, a sociological project. Please welcome him.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you very much to the organizers, Anna, Ophelia. Thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be surrounded by so renowned speakers, scholars, and artists. I want to thank in advance our translators, and I will try to do my best to speak slowly. My presentation is titled The Trauma Metaphor, a Sociological Perspective, or rather a Sociological Critique. Trauma, a concept originally applied to individuals, describing the wounds to the body or the injuries inflicted on the spirit, has been transferred to the social, to the collective realm, seemingly without harm to the concept itself. How do we conceptualize the transition from the traumatized individual to the traumatized community? If the consequences of devastating events for individuals and groups run different courses, why do we use the word trauma to explain a wide array of social and cultural phenomena? These are the questions I would like to pose in this presentation. Trauma has become part of our moral and political vocabulary. It has become a major signifier, key term in our age. In The Empire of Trauma, authors Didier Fassin and Richard Reitman write that trauma is today not a clinical but a moral judgment. Are metaphorical and empirical trauma concepts compatible with each other? In terms of understanding how collectivities process knowledge about past violence in different spheres, familial, communal, societal, have we gained by using the concept of trauma? There are a number of problems, of obstacles, challenges that I would like to point out and pose also for discussion later. Trauma theory tends to see all that are impacted by violence as suffering from trauma, and therefore as unable to retell their past and to act as agents. As Wolf Kannsteiner puts it, those exposed to violence are summarily turned into victims. Same happens with descendants, with children or grandchildren of those exposed to violence. The assumption that there is always an impact on the psychic structure of the descendants of survivors is rooted in the trauma attributed to survivors in the first place. For instance, with Holocaust survivors, are all suffering from trauma? Survivor in itself is a very broad concept that comprises a myriad of different experiences. From those who survived concentration camps or survived in hiding, or those who immigrated at the early stages of Nazism from Germany. Carol Kidron, who has a wonderful book titled The Ethnography of Silence, it's a research on Holocaust survivors' narratives, she argues that the effect of verbal silence is not necessarily disturbing or traumatic. Instead, silent traces transmit tacit knowledge of the past within everyday family life. Knowledge is verbally articulated or it is also embodied. Then there is the problem of a simple projection of psychic processes onto the social sphere. Victims confront their past after decades of repression and denial of the traumatic events, and so do societies. There's this assumption that unpleasant memories are repressed, but after a period of latency, they do inescapably come back to the surface, both for victims and for societies. This is this projection. In this regard, the silence and belated emergence of memories of atrocities has often been explained in accordance with this psychoanalytically inspired trauma theory. But there are other causes, besides trauma, that may have prevented victims from speaking out, including a lack of suitable interlocutors, the inability to reach the public sphere. And Spain's transición is a case in point. It has been commented before, and they're expert on that period in the room. But let me briefly highlight some aspects. Given its role as a source of continuing conflict, it was believed the divided past of the Spaniards should not play a role in this time of transition, and neither the victors nor the vanquished would use the past for political purposes. That was the unspoken pact agreed on at the time. The culture of the transición strived for consensus and struggled to avoid conflict in a country where stability and democracy would not be secured in the blink of an eye. Francesc Torres this morning made reference to this period as well, and to these difficulties and of that, the balances that were struck at the time and the options that were taken by the political actors of the time. Obviously, voices of victims of Francoism at that time did not reach the public sphere. 25 years later, the tables have turned dramatically. If the leitmotif of the transición was to turn the page of history and look ahead in order to overcome the past, the memory movement that emerged in the heat of the first mass grave exhumation reverses this relationship and urges Spanish society to look back. In this shift towards remembrance of what had previously deemed a divisive past, the concept and theory of trauma, understood as social trauma, traumatized societies, metaphors of the open wound, and the return of the repressed, all have played an important role as representational devices, and interestingly, on both sides of the political divide. Memory advocates maintain that the wounds are open and that they will close with memoria histórica, with the cultural and political practice, legal interventions of memoria histórica. The movement's opponents assert that the wounds have long been closed and the historical memory movement risks opening them up again. During this time, the 2000 mainly, this decade, Argentinian memory and human rights culture provided a fundamental source of images and tropes that disappeared. It inspired cultural, legal, political initiatives in the Spanish field of memoria histórica. A new generation started to look at Spain's past as Europeans and global citizens, and an exceptionalist approach gave way to an universalist understanding of how a society should confront a past of extreme violence and state terror. The return of the repressed? Hardly so. The previous absence of memory narratives, of memory interventions in the public sphere did not necessarily mean the existence of a traumatic block. It indicated the absence of a favorable context for the memory's reception and moreover for memory's articulation. So to understand this phenomenon, we must incorporate the analysis of cultural structures and social processes. Jeffrey Alexander's cultural trauma theory is particularly helpful. The term trauma in cultural trauma theory might be misleading, given that we're talking here about something quite different, but I'll come back to that in a second. What is cultural trauma? According to Alexander, cultural trauma occurs when members of a collective feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness. Events do not in and of themselves create collective trauma. Events are not inherently traumatic. Trauma, according to Alexander, is a socially mediated attribution. In other words, events are retroactively imbued with traumatic meaning. This is different to the psychological understanding of trauma. Here, the traumatic events, the identified source of suffering, is perceived lucidly by the actors. I quote Alexander again, shared trauma depends on collective processes of cultural interpretation. What does this mean? The past has to be coded, has to be narrated, typified, ritualized. It has to be named or renamed. And we have many cases here at the university or in the state of Minnesota about renaming processes. There's also metaphorical bridging, and this is an essential essential to the social process of moral engagement. The Franco-Hitler analogy, Franco-Hitler equation, Emilio Silva's article, "My father was also a missing person in the year 2000," an equation between what happened in Spain with the Francoist repression, an analogy with the Argentinian disappeared that were clearly visible in the public consciousness of Spain at the time. So trauma is a question of narrative construction in this view. When at the individual level we have denial, repression, working through psychic trauma, at the collective level, a quite different thing is occurring. There is symbolic construction and framing. So in contrast to any clinical understanding of the concept of personal trauma, the traumatic significance of an event in socio-cultural terms must be socially established and accepted. And this also entails a struggle over meaning, which involves identifying the nature of the pain, the nature of the victim. It implies attributing responsibilities. In this process of renaming the past in Spain, generational positionality, global memory constellations, the human rights regime, the Holocaust, the Argentinian disappeared and its memory played a key role. But one can cite also many other examples. The work we are doing at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies for over 2 years, the process of representation of the so-called US Dakota War, a process of, it transitions from the Sioux massacres perpetrated by the Sioux, to an act of dispossession and genocide. How narrative coding, naming, renaming, typification, Fort Snelling, the internment camp where Dakota non-combatants were imprisoned before their forced removal, is not anymore an internment camp. According to the Minnesota Historical Society, it is a concentration camp. Metaphorical bridging with the Holocaust. Next Monday, in Canada, it's Canadian Residential School Survivor Day. Every schools in Canada will hold events that honor, that remember, and that teach about this historical event, typification, ritualization, in Alexander's terms. So there's a trauma process between the event themselves and the representation. Joachim Sabelsberg, my colleague in the sociology department, puts it very articulately in the following ways in a forthcoming book on the cultural processing of the Armenian genocide. What once was diffuse and chaotic in the minds of those who were exposed to horrific events begins to take shape, gets into focus. It becomes organized. Only after such transformations are groups, including their descendants, in a position to communicate effectively about terrifying experiences, potentially sharing them as solidified knowledge with others who were not directly involved. There is claim-making of carrier groups or mnemonic entrepreneurs. It's a word that's used in the sociological literature. There's agency by these groups, of course, but not only. Because, paraphrasing Max Weber, ideal and material interest can be pursued only along the tracks that have been laid out by larger cultural ideas. So this is a very fruitful theoretical framework, that of cultural trauma theory, fruitful to illuminate the process by which certain violent events transition from silence or from absence to salience, to visibility, and how they get into focus for the groups themselves and the public consciousness. But as mentioned before, why the term trauma? And this would be my critique of, not of the theory, but of the term that Alexander uses, cultural trauma theory. Because what we have here is the workings of collective memory. And of course, as Patrick has pointed out, memory is also a very polysemic term. I didn't know that there were 275 or 333, but I knew there were many different understandings of memory. But the one I'm employing here is a very confined sociological understanding based on Maurice Halbwachs, which is quite simply knowledge about the past that is mutually acknowledged and reinforced by a group. We must add for these cases that this is knowledge of, and I'm inclined almost to say traumatic events, but I won't, knowledge of violent events in the past to which individuals of that group have a connection through communal membership. Let me bring in another example. A recent book by Janet Jacobs titled The Holocaust Across Generations, Trauma and Its Inheritance Among Descendants of Survivors. In this book, Jacobs examines family narratives and social relations through which Holocaust experiences are transmitted to children and grandchildren of survivors, and how these experiences inform their sense of self, their social and religious identities, and instill in them a duty of transmission towards the larger community and to the next generations. The term trauma in the title of the book, and profusely employed by the author throughout the different chapters, I find here also problematic. Is the term trauma helpful as a conceptual tool to explore the examined phenomena? Or put differently, which of the different understandings of trauma is at play in the manifold generational dynamics that the author analyzes? Sometimes the unsettling power of the original injury reaches the next generation in the specific familial setting. Remembrance is unassimilated and periodically returns to haunt the individual, and there's several examples from the interviews of the author that illustrate this. It is of such force that it is repressed. It is not registered in the consciousness of the affected individual, and then it shows belated symptoms. In other words, psychological trauma. And Ana Miñarro mentioned the examples of this yesterday. I don't need to go into more detail. But other examples do not necessarily entail the powerful reflection of a primary trauma with its psychological aftershocks. Rather, these are the workings of collective memory, in which knowledge of the past is being passed on in particular narrative configurations, ritual practices. In this case, it's, the examples shown are several religious rituals from the Jewish tradition, other family traditions in the families interviewed, and spatial settings, for instance, visits to concentration camps. These naturally cement the connective bond between generations, and such knowledge will remain firmly embedded in the individual's consciousness. Jacobs also identifies among children and grandchildren a missionary zeal to keep the Holocaust in the public consciousness. The author uses the term trauma carriers and representatives of Holocaust trauma. But this type of social involvement requires, firstly, that individuals see themselves as members of a collectivity that suffered violence and share a victimized identity, in line with trauma theory of Alexander. Secondly, there is a need for an audience. So psychological trauma would be absent since descendants are only able to retell their past, to retell this past. Not only they're able to do that, but also to act as agents and engage in memorialization and education efforts. Interestingly, descendancy itself is understood as a distinct identity. Second generation, third generation. It's clear in the case of Holocaust survivors, also in some other, in the case of other genocides. But I would say in the case of the Holocaust here in the US, particularly distinctive. So it's an identity and also a worldview for children and grandchildren of people whose biographies intersect with the Holocaust. In sum, in this book, but also more broadly, and I cite this as an example, we seem to be moving back and forth from the context and specific interactional conditions that implant a sort of vicarious wound in the psychological health of the descendants, trauma as an empirical reality, to the social cultural circumstances that enable and inform identity, agency, and engagement in the public sphere. Here, trauma is a metaphor. The sociological phenomenon of descendants, as I said, second, third generation, also fourth generation, it reveals that trauma and trauma attribution are employed by social actors in the meaning-making process. Considering the current use of the term trauma, we come against an epistemic confusion that was already noted by sociologist Alfred Schütz, a classic sociologist from the 30s. And bear with me for one more round of theory here before I come to the conclusion. Schütz makes a distinction between first-order constructs and second-order constructs. First-order constructs are the participants' common sense interpretations of in their own words. Second-order constructs are the researchers, the scholars' interpretations based on first-order constructs. So if we apply this to trauma, and Schütz did not do that, we were talking, this was 80 years ago. So if we apply this first and second order to trauma, trauma starts as a clinical term. So it's a second-order construct. But it enters into the common sense discourse. It is widely used by social actors, as for instance, descendants of survivors, memory activists, human rights organizations. So the clinical concept is vernacularized to some extent. Something similar happens with the term genocide. It is a legal term. It's typified in international law. That's how it starts. But it has also become so much part of our moral and political vocabulary. It is a metaphor for the worst possible evil. back to trauma. It seems that trauma as first-order construct is seeping into scholarship, and what we have is in scholarship a myriad of very different meanings. So I come to the conclusion, which is not only mine. Several scholars in the field of collective memory, of Holocaust and genocide studies, have identified the problem and cautioned of the problem of trauma inflation. In order to explain the dynamics, the politics, the cultural practices of historical memory and amnesia after mass violence, we must be also open to other more fruitful theoretical frameworks and conceptual tools. I'll leave it here. Thank you for your attention.